Hey guys, welcome back to the UNCOMMODiFiED podcast and to another unpeddling conversation that Chris and I are going to have together tonight. No guests, just Chris and I going to have a chat about something that we've been talking about for a number of years actually. But more recently, we've been chatting about this again and thought we'd let you in this conversation. So I'm going to kick it over to Chris and we'll get started. Chris, what conversation should we be having tonight?
Well, I think the conversation we wanted to have, and we were talking about this a little while ago, was just digging into how to have complicated conversations with customers or prospects or kind of whatever life cycle stage, people you're working with from a sales standpoint are at. And when I think of somebody who does this really well, I've been on the road with Tim and we've done this together. And through my experience, I have come to understand that Tim has a very interesting way of being able to have extremely difficult conversations and straightforward conversations with customers in a way that doesn't come across as he's a complete jerk. And, there's a skill in that because it's so easy, I think, in these conversations to come across not in the best light. And I think the importance from my perspective on complicated conversations is although they're confusing, they're very pivotal in being able to deliver a fantastic partnership. And even though they're hard to manage and all that kind of stuff, they're very important for us to understand how we do so. I'm really excited to kind of pick Tim's brain about some of the reasons why these conversations are so important, but also some of the strategies and tactics that you use to have those conversations. So that's kind of where we're going to go tonight. And so I guess maybe to kick things off, why are having complicated conversations with customers important? And maybe also in that question, maybe just to define for people, what would you describe as a complicated conversation?
Sure. So first of all, I think this really tucks into the whole concept we're talking about in this idea of unpeddling. And that is, if all you're doing is peddling and selling shit, frankly, to people, then you are never, ever going to want to have a real conversation with people. And when you're not peddling, when you're selling well, and when you're creating partnership, then ultimately what you're creating is a great relationship. And because it's a great relationship or partnership, it is going to have conflict within it. Every relationship does. It is going to have disappointment in it. It is going to have times where you absolutely create customer delight. And there's going to be times where, frankly, your customer is not going to delight you very much, or you and your team may shit the bed every once in a while in the servicing of that customer. And so when we move beyond just transactions, when we move into real relationship and when we're really unpeddling, then by nature of that, we're going to come into the human experience of the transaction. And that means there's going to be great things and there's going to be challenging things. And if we cannot have honest, respectful, that's really important, honest, respectful conversations with our partners, then those relationships, those partnerships are going to break down and they're not going to have that integrity to them that has to be part of this if we're really going to unpeddle the experience. And so I think that's where the starting point is that if we're trying to create real relationship with our customer, then there is naturally going to be conflict points. There's going to be times in which we rub against each other. And if we can't have an honest conversation with them and them with us, it's a two-way street, then we fundamentally are going to have problems that are going to get in the way of this relationship and ultimately the business that we might do together.
Well, and I think, too, that's a good point. And I think a lot of salespeople enter relationships with customers almost with rose-colored glasses on. Not that I don't think all salespeople are naive to think that conflict doesn't arise, but I think we do like to put the blinders on that we're going to be the ones that have to address it and deal with it at some point. And I think a lot of times we may just think, well, we'll kind of just glaze over it and glaze past it. And, we won't really address certain things. We'll just kind of ignore them in hoping that they'll go away. And I think one of the things that we've talked about before, I don't know, I think it might have been from a book or something, but this whole concept of being able to enter into the tunnel of chaos in terms of relationship and being able to have tough conversations in that tunnel of chaos. And that's actually where true relationship is found. And I think that is an important thing to remember in this whole concept of having complicated conversations. If you can't enter into the tunnel of chaos, whatever that looks like, with a customer in a respectful way, are you really building a deep relationship that's going to drive buying patterns at the end of the day? So I think that is a really good point. And so one of the things is, I think that is very important, is how we lay the foundation for this. So what are some things that you do in the beginning of a relationship, whether it's, taking over a customer from somebody that's been a customer for a company a long time or a new prospect? Like, what are some of the foundational things you do in the beginning of the relationship to set the stage for these conversations?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a really good point, Chris, because there's a foundation to this. You can't, a year into a relationship, just out of the blue, try to manage a complex, complicated conversation between a buyer and seller if you haven't been, frankly, preparing for this day from the very beginning. And this might sound strange to people who are listening, who are sales professionals or marketing professionals, but I have a different way of approaching these things. As you know, Chris, you and I have spent time, as you mentioned earlier, we've been on the road together. We've worked with sales teams together, and we've been in situations where we're entering into the nitty-gritty of the sales world together with them. Well, I do this with your team sometimes now as I consult you and your team, and I've done this with you in the past in the former company that you worked with. But for me, you start setting this up in the moments in the beginning of the relationship. The reality is that as sales professionals, I think sometimes we want to pretend that we're never, ever going to disappoint the customer and they're never going to disappoint us. And that's just not true. That if we work with each other long enough, frankly, we're going to piss the customer off at some point. And frankly, they're probably going to piss us off at some point. And so from the very beginning, as I begin to discover and understand the customer and understand their business and their goals, I'm going to have a very early initial foundational conversation about expectations. And this is where it all starts. And part of it is understanding, what do we expect of each other? Do we expect perfection? And frankly, if your customer expects perfection, that's where you need to address it from the very beginning, because perfection is not possible. And so laying the expectations that we're going to strive for excellence, and by the way, excellence is different than perfection. We're going to strive for excellence, but there's a possibility that we may disappoint you, and understanding how you're going to handle that in advance. And I know, again, this sounds crazy to salespeople that you would do that early in the relationship, but what I've found is that when you're that honest with a customer up front, they just recognize that that's just true and it's the truth. And what it does is it creates equity of trust when we have an honest conversation from the very beginning. And so when I'm beginning a relationship with a customer, and when I coach people to begin a relationship with a customer, I'm going to coach them to have a deep discussion about expectations. And one of the expectations we're going to talk about with a customer early on is, what do you expect from us in relationship to what happens when we disappoint you? How are we going to handle that? And frankly, you also have to explain to the customer that there's going to be times possibly when they don't do what they need to do. And you're going to ask them early on, how are you going to do that? In a sense, you're setting up the negotiation or the framework in the very beginning, that 6 months from now, when there is a problem, or if there is a problem, this is how respectful partners are going to handle it. So in my opinion, it starts from the very beginning. It sets a reasonable expectation, and we set a sense of equity. That's the real big part, because when a customer, when you give all the power to a customer, you cannot ever have a complicated conversation. If they're not going to give you all the power, but if you give them all the power, then you cannot negotiate, and you cannot have a complicated or difficult conversation if things are coming apart or something's happening, unless you have a sense of equity with your customer. And it starts from the very beginning of how you set the stage for that.
And so how do you balance that with a huge level of respect, because I think what you're talking about is, complicated. You're really talking about getting into confrontation in some type of degree, whether, depending how you define confrontation. But and so I think, one, how do you do that respectfully is one question. But another thing to what you said is, I think, from my perspective, what you talk about setting expectations up front, which you do very clearly, and again, I've seen you do this firsthand. You very clearly outline expectations with customers, which I think is difficult for a lot of people to begin with. But I would say the more difficult thing isn't just outlining it up front, because that is theoretical, is when the shit hits the fan and there's a real problem. How do you actually go and address it? So if, I guess my first question would be, how do we do that respectfully? And then my second question would be is, why do you think salespeople, even if they do define expectations, don't enter into those conversations when things are really going wrong?
Sure. And it's a great question. And again, the listeners just need to understand part of my background. I mean, I've been doing coaching and training of salespeople for a long, long time. And in a particular industry, actually, since 2004, most of my consulting has happened in a particular industry, which is a pretty down and dirty, nitty gritty kind of industry. And so I think, Chris, it starts in that embryonic stage of how you're going to handle conflict. In that there's two simple principles, I think, that really are the sort of the birthplace of how you handle this. One is go first, and what I mean by that is that if I'm in a tense situation with a customer, or something's not working, or I've disappointed them and I missed a deadline, we were supposed to ship and we never did, and whatever it is, and there's lots of things that can happen in a relationship. I always maintain the proposition that I'm going to go first, meaning I am going to admit what my contribution to the problem was first. And I am going to place on the table not only my admission that I am complicit in the problem, but I will go first with the solution that I can bring. And then in that context, I will invite the customer to join me in solving this problem. So that's, first of all, the first way that I do that. In that, again, if you take a proposition, and even if the problem is 90% the customer, and sometimes it is, it's 90% their fault, or their system's fault, or their people's fault at the end of the day, I'm going to own my 10%. I'm going to own my piece first, and then invite them into it. Because as I do that, I'm modeling what I want. The second piece of that respectful nature to that is to make sure that when we're entering into a difficult conversation with a customer and we're in that conflict or tension point, that what we do is that we avoid accusation. We have to avoid accusation. We need to maintain curiosity. And there's a powerful balance in there. And so instead of accusing a customer or of a certain behavior, or not even the behavior, but why you think it happened, instead of accusing them and their team of something that is maybe not correct, we take a position of curiosity and exploration. If we're accusing customers, if we're accusing their people, it's never going to go well. We're going to create tension and adversarial relationship. What we need to create is allies around a table. And ultimately, what we need to do is take the problem and put it on the table in front of us, and then philosophically get us and the customer around the table to solve the problem together. We need to remember, and this is really critical, that the customer is not the problem. The person in front of you is not the problem. And as long as you maintain those tensions, you go first, you maintain a place of curiosity and not accusation, and you take the problem and you make it ancillary or outside of yourself and the customer. You can gather yourself and their team around to solve that problem for the benefit of both. Those are three key things, I believe, that really set the stage for great conversations that can be difficult at times.
Well, and I think too, I think it's good to define as well, like, as people who are looking to set better expectations, and which in and of itself is going to get you into some more complicated conversations than I think a lot of people maybe are used to, I think it's important that people frame the reasoning and the importance of defining expectations as essential, not just something that's nice to do. Because again, going down the road with a customer and getting into these things does get difficult. It does get complicated. But I think that's where if we see it just as a nice to have, I think we take a certain posture to how we do it. Versus if we look at it as an essential thing for building good relationship down the line, I think we look at it a little bit differently. And so I think that is an important delineation to make sure that we're paying attention to, is that what we're talking about is, and what we're saying is, complicated conversations are absolutely essential to having good partnerships. And if you are not having complicated conversations with your customers, there is underlying problems that you most likely don't know about and can't get in front of and deal with. So I think, again, complicated conversations with customers from a sales perspective, there's almost a defensive strategy to this, because you're getting in front and addressing problems before they've had a chance to really ruminate and embed themselves and define the relationship. You're actually getting in front of that. And so I think that's an important thing. And so why do you think that downstream, why do you think that salespeople have such a hard time with addressing problems when they do occur?
Yeah, I think so I want to just tuck back into something you said, and then I'll go into that. But I do think it's so, if the customer is willing to have a complicated conversation, a difficult conversation, that's a good sign. So first of all, I want to just say that. And so salespeople who are afraid when it gets difficult, they're missing the point. Because when you think it's good and it's not, that's the kiss of death. It is much better for a customer to be transparent and honest and tell you when things are difficult, that you can enter into it, because it's a great sign of equity, trust, and relationship. That's what I want to say first. So if you're a sales professional and you're finding yourself in difficult conversations with customers, that's a great sign, because they're willing to enter into that conversation with you. That's what I want to say, first of all. That's an important piece of it. But when it comes to these conversations that we're having, going back to this expectation management, the thing is that we have to ground this in the real world. And mutual respect is a critical part of working together long term. If we're going to create relationships with our customers that last not just 6 months, but they last a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. I have some customer relationships that I've had, for 15, 20 years. And if you're going to journey long enough with people, you're going to have difficulty along the way. But if you can find a place of inviting people in, I think salespeople are afraid partly because we give the customer too much power. Frankly, at the end of the day, they spend a certain amount of money, and we maybe earn a certain amount of income from that transaction, our company does. And whenever we get fearful and we operate out of a place of fear, we are going to put ourselves in a negative situation. And I'll give an example in the real world so that people can understand what we're really talking about. Recently, I had a customer that I work with, and they had a difficult situation. They had a customer who spends a lot of money with their company, but this particular customer was interacting with their team, with this company's team, inappropriately. And I think most salespeople, if you've sold long enough, you've got those customers every once in a while that we all excuse their behavior and say, "Oh, that's just the way Joe is," and Joe always talks to everybody like that, and that's just the way it is. Well, to be honest, and this might shock people, I think that's actually brutally wrong. That Joe is that way because we let Joe be that way, in my opinion. And so this particular situation, derailed and eroded to the point where this particular customer was treating this particular internal and external team of this company absolutely inappropriately. And then there became a struggle of how to deal with it. And, should we address it? Shouldn't we address it? And I can tell you, I sat with the senior leaders of that company and I asked them some very difficult questions about what it is that they wanted to send a message about. Who did they want to be? What did respect mean to them? What does dealing well in the market look like them? Would they ever treat a customer like that? And the answer was no. And in the end, they made a difficult call to that customer. And what they said was respectful. Really want to do business with you. Appreciate you choosing to do business with us. We know you have choices, but we want to be clear. This is inappropriate behavior, and you cannot be speaking to our staff members like that. And if you choose to continue to treat our people like that, we are not going to do business with you anymore. That is powerful. That's difficult, and it's powerful. Now, right now, they're in the tunnel of chaos. They're wrestling it out. Customers saying, screw you, I'm taking my business somewhere else. Here's my experience. That customer, most likely, will find their way back eventually. Because they're going to recognize that this wasn't a mean thing, but this was a respectful thing in the end. Because those people would never treat his employees, that customer's employees, like that. And eventually, that will pay dividends in the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, not that I'm an expert on neuroscience and stuff, but I have been reading this book and listened to a podcast about talking about the neuroscience of the fight or flight mentality. I think it's the amygdala. I want to say is that part of your brain that gets triggered. And one of the things that I've been reading in this book called Sales EQ by Jeb Blount, which is a fantastic book, is he talks about the barriers to salespeople doing the things they need to are often because of what he would call disruptive emotions. And so he talks about this fight or flight mentality that we don't all of a sudden when we're challenged or in an uncomfortable situation, all of these things of fear, desperation, anxiety, they rise and we lose the ability to think logically. And I think when we get into complicated conversations, I think a lot of the reason why salespeople struggle to enter into those is because their disruptive emotions take over the logical side of their brain and they just want to leave. They're not gonna, they don't want to deal with it. Or again, this is where I think you get into that side of being disrespectful. Is if a customer challenges you and you're disrespectful, that's triggering the fight side of your personality. And again, that doesn't accomplish anything either. And I think that's from a neuroscience standpoint. I think that's an interesting thing as well, is being able to control our disruptive emotions and having tactics to make sure that, we're able to compose ourselves when these types of things arise, because often you don't always have the time to plan a complicated conversation. You're in a meeting and something comes up and you have to react very quickly to the comments that are made. And I think, as you said before, that foundation of trust and transparency and honesty and some relationship is very important to making those go well. But I think also being able to really make sure that you are keeping your disruptive emotions in check is extremely important as well.
It's totally true. I mean, you have to be able to contain yourself when you have these conversations. They have to be respectful. They have to be well crafted. And I think the other thing too is that we need to have a habit of dealing with things as they come up and not allow the cumulative effect to destroy us. Because what I've seen over the years is, there's a problem in a customer relationship and we ignore it. And then there's another problem and we ignore it. And there's another problem and we ignore it. And then there's another problem and we wrap up all the frustrations of those last three problems. And now this thing just gets blown out of the water and out of proportion. The reality is that we need to have those conversations early and often. When things are off track, we need to respectfully ask the questions and get into the conversation earlier. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I've seen salespeople and sales managers and VPs of sales, frankly, over the years not do well. They allow these things to build up. And oftentimes I've had conversations with customers where we're talking about a difficult customer and they're complaining about them. And I ask them this question: so does this behavior surprise you? And they're like, no, it's always been like that. And I'm like, okay. So when have you addressed it before? Well, we never have. Okay, well, maybe, again, this is part of the problem here. So we have to create an environment where we can have those conversations both sides. And the other thing is this ties back to the conversation we had with Mike Casey about story. And that is, when there is a problem, there are two sides of the story. And this is where we have to, again, this is where we pull ourselves back from frustration and emotional response and basically putting our narrative onto the customer's story. We need to be going into these not with a series of answers and accusations, but questions. Questions are our friends. So, hey, Mr. Customer, when you guys did this, can I ask you a question? I'm curious. What were you intending would be the outcome of that behavior? Mr. Customer, when you offended our map pricing policy and started cutting the bottom out of the market, and I've seen this happen, Chris, you've seen this happen, and now we got to have a difficult conversation with them. It's easy to assume they did it for certain reasons, which are always evil. The reality is they might have done it for another reason. Whether we like the behavior or not, we need to understand through questions what drove the behavior. And then once we understand that, we can have a better conversation. And I have had those conversations on behalf of my clients over the years where I have had to go into markets and talk to people about how they were selling. But again, this goes back to expectation management. When I have that initial discovery conversation with a customer where I'm learning about them, understanding, and laying expectation, if I have a strong understanding or expectation that let's say I'm a manufacturer and I'm selling into the wholesale distribution chain, if I have a strong expectation that people are going to sell my product at a good price in the market, a fair price to maintain its integrity, then it's up to me to tell them that and explain what that means in real language. And if I haven't done that, how in the world am I going to hold them accountable to something later on? And this goes back to, again, to laying expectations. And then getting into those waters with the customer, making the problem our problem, not their problem. They're not the problem. Their people aren't the problem. Separating ourselves, and again, as you said, pulling ourselves back from the emotional response to it. And my experience tells me that we do that by, again, looking at things sequentially and having a plan in place in advance. Having a discussion with a customer in advance. When there's a problem, how are we going to solve it together? That will take away some of that emotional response that gets locked up into these things.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So, a personal question. Have you ever felt deep desperation to keep a customer? Because the way that, and we've been on the road together, we've been in many customer interactions together, and I get a feeling like you have no desperation bone in your body. That if a customer isn't going to work with us and partner with us in a way that's respectful and mutual, you have no problem telling them to go pound salt in the nicest way possible. But I'm going to assume maybe that's just you handling your disruptive emotions properly. But so honestly, how does desperation come into this for you? Because I think that is a driving factor why people do not want to address these things head on.
I totally agree. And I think, again, this starts in the very beginning. When we haven't created a relationship of equity, when there isn't a mutuality in the relationship, and when there's an imbalance, that's where desperation comes. That's where, the reality is, I need the customer maybe a little bit more than they need me. Okay, maybe that's the reality. But if I allow that to become that clawing desperation, I am going to put myself in a negative position from the very beginning. And so, again, this might sound strange to you if you're listening, if you're a salesperson or a sales leader or sales manager. I actually believe that what Chris is talking about is really critical. I don't have a desperate bone in my body. I am not going to beg somebody to buy from me or be my partner. And at the end of the day, my experience tells me over almost 30 years of doing this, that the initial conversations and behavior of the customer typically are their best. And sometimes what happens is, again, if you think about a relationship, if you're dating somebody, you're going on a date, you usually are trying to be on your best behavior. And so the initial behavior in a customer relationship is usually the best behavior. And frankly, if you see signs early that this isn't going to be a healthy relationship, shame on you for entering into it. That's what I really believe. I believe a lot of times we end up with the relationship we have, but we knew we were going to have them in the very beginning. Now, listen, sometimes you sell to people for different reasons, and that's okay. Sometimes you just have a transactionary customer in front of you, not a partner. That's fine. Just don't pretend they're a real partner. But if your goal is to create partnership, then you have to do it out of a place of mutuality. That you have to believe that you have a strong value proposition. And if you don't believe that you can bring disproportionate value to that customer, you are always going to be behind the eight ball. You're always going to be in that desperation mode, and you're going to put up with stuff that you never should put up. And I'll give you another quick story, and Chris, you might even remember this, but when I first started consulting with a company a couple of years ago, I began to get very nitty-gritty in their Canadian sales division. And early on, I got a complaint call from a customer about something because I was de facto I was really acting as a Canadian sales director for this particular organization and leading through a brand integration and some other things, although I wasn't an employee of the company. I did carry the business card for them, and so from the customer's perspective, I worked for the company, although technically I didn't. And early on, I got an angry call from somebody who was really pissed about a problem. And I didn't know the person at all. And frankly, they were speaking to me in a way that I would never, ever speak to them or their employees. And I finally said to the guy, and I won't use his name, I stopped him in his tracks. And some people won't believe this is true, but I'm telling you it's true. My mother's grave, this is true. I stopped him dead in his track, and I respectfully said, can I just say something? We don't know each other at all. And I want to be really clear. I would never, ever speak to you the way you're speaking to me right now, and I never to speak to any of your employees. And I'm asking, I know you're frustrated. I'm happy to help you, but you need to stop talking to me like that. Well, he continued on, and I stopped him again, and I said on the phone, can I be very clear? If you keep talking to me like that, I'm going to hang up. And he said, you would never hang up. And I said, try me. And he went on swearing again, and I hung up on him. And you know what? That's the way it is. Now, he called me back. He said, you hung up? I said, yes, I told you I would. I said, look, can we start again? And so we started the conversation again. Now, this customer turned out, frankly, to be a very difficult customer. And a customer eventually that we found out was actually undermining us in the market. And I had to take an aggressive stand with them eventually and have difficult conversation. Here's the thing, is that when I had that first conversation on the phone and I had the last conversation when we effectively took them out of the market, everyone in the company knew that that's always that way that customer was. See, that's the reality is. And you know what? I told them, you can take your business and you can go somewhere else. I'll replace you tomorrow with somebody else. Now, that may be arrogance, or it might just be confidence. But if you are desperate and you are clamoring for the customer's attention, you will allow them always to run rudshot right over you. And that is not a healthy relationship. And frankly, if that's just the kind of relationship you want as a sales professional or a company, you can have them. I don't want those relationships, and I would never counsel my customers to enter into them. They're abusive, they're inappropriate, and they will never, they may return money, but they'll never return the goodwill that we need within a relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And as you said, the word confidence, like I think that's where as salespeople, like personally, I think salespeople need to do a gut check whether they actually believe in what their company's doing and whether they believe that that company's adding value. Because as you said, if there's not a level of confidence around being able to deliver to other customers and being able to succeed in spite of, when we get into these customer relationships that just are not going to go anywhere good, I think as salespeople, you need to do a gut check of yourself. And if you can't believe that there's any other customers who are going to, come and be better partners than, as you said, Tim, an abusive customer, then, I think you need to quit and go find another job that you can believe in, because I think that is where you cause desperation. It causes, if we don't keep this customer, then what are we going to do? And then we start again, just accepting behavior that is predictably not going to go in a good direction. And, we need to protect our teams. We need to protect, people like in my company, we have outside salespeople and reps and inside salespeople. And, sometimes, those people are the ones who take the brunt of these abusive customers. And frankly, we stand idly by sometimes, and that's not appropriate. And as you said, Tim, there's a predictable outcome in the future. It's more of a when rather than an if things are going to happen because of the type of people that you're accepting to deal with. So, and again, everybody's not going to be a number one partner. There is absolutely going to be some people who we choose to sell to, and they're not partners, but they're fine to deal with. And you know what I mean? It is what it is. And that's fine business to have, but we shouldn't expect anything more from them.
No, I totally agree. And listen, this tips back into the title, of these episodes, Unpeddling. Sometimes we peddle our people. We sell our people out. And I've had very difficult conversation with sales leaders over the years and ultimately said to them, you are selling out the mental health of your people for the money you're making on that customer. And that is a bad trade-off. And again, that's a hill I'm going to die on, and some people may not like it, and some people might think that I'm foolish. I've been around a long time, and I believe that you can do this respectfully with customers. And you can set a tone. But again, this goes back to, we talked about, what's the foundation? The foundation is expectation, articulation, and management. But in addition, another strategy that I've used is that when I look at defining expectations, I always make my list much bigger than the customers. And there's a reason for that, because I'll always have a bigger piece of this pie to be managing. And so my expectation list that I lay out or what I commit to the customer is always bigger than what I expect of the customer. And what that will do in the beginning is it instantly creates trust and respect. And you can leverage against that trust and respect. A lot of times the reason why we can't have difficult conversation with customers is we don't have enough equity in the bank to have it. Stephen Covey years ago described relationships in this analogy of bank accounts. And ultimately, he talked about the fact that you need to put money in, and sometimes you take money out. And when you take money out, if you're not careful, you don't have enough balance, you go NSF. You have non-sufficient funds. These kind of complicated situations or difficult conversations with customers take some money out of the bank. If you have nothing in the bank, you have nothing to trade on. And so I've always seen meeting expectations and doing more and participating in the relationship at a higher level as my ante into the pot. It gives me something that I can then leverage against. And again, I'll tell a quick story because it's an example of this. Again, for that company that I was managing, that Canadian division, we had a great partner that we began to develop a relationship with. And Chris, you know this partner. And early on, I was out on the road, frankly, busting my ass on the road, doing training and getting involved and helping this customer build their business so that they could leverage this relationship to their advantage in the market. And in one of the meetings that I was having, one of their managers, frankly, made a real faux pas in the meeting. I have another word for it, but I'll use faux pas, and challenged me in front of a group of people about something, and it was inappropriate. There was a problem that they wanted solved, but to bring it up in that environment when I was trying to train people was absolutely inappropriate. And it made the conversation difficult, and it was awkward and all this. Now, here's what I did. I didn't just pretend it didn't happen. I was respectful to the person. I did not speak to them about it after, but I went to my counterpart that I had negotiated this whole deal with, and I asked him respectfully. I explained the situation, and I said, listen, we cannot work together as partners if we're going to undermine each other. I would never undermine you or your senior leaders in a meeting. I expect that you guys won't do that to me. If there's a problem, I'm happy to discuss it, but not in a group of other people. And you know what that partner did? That partner went on my behalf, and he spoke to that person. And a year or two later, one of the strongest relationships I had in that company was with that guy who challenged me in that meeting because we respectfully dealt with it. Now, he had a concern, and we solved that problem. We didn't ignore it. But we also didn't just allow that behavior to stand. And that is critical about managing great relationship. And my experience tells me that the people that you go in that tunnel of chaos that you talked about, Chris, which is from a book that Scott Peck wrote. This idea of the tunnel of chaos is where we go in and wrestle it out and we fight it out when we want real relationship with people. My experience tells me over the years that the customers that I have personally gone into the tunnel of chaos with, or customers that I've encouraged my customers to go into that tunnel with, when they've done it with respect and they've done it with a sense of equity and a sense of mutuality, that they came out the other side with a better relationship and a stronger partner. That has been my experience over a quarter century. So anybody who's going to try to tell me that it's nonsense, you should just excuse the behavior of customers, never have a difficult conversation, let them do whatever they want to do because they're making money off them, I'm going to disagree with you until I die, because I think it's absolutely wrong and it's not my experience. What I've experienced over the years is that you can have great, difficult conversations with customers for the sake of solving problems that are getting in your way and their way, that are affecting their profitability and your profitability. And if a customer is not willing to go in there and have that conversation with you, then ultimately it's a greater sign that a bigger problem is coming and you probably will never avoid it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. So as we kind of start wrapping this up, what would you say would be two things that two pieces of advice you would give somebody who's nervous about entering into these types of conversations with customers? What's two pieces of advice that you would leave them with to think about?
Okay, so first of all, I would say, the thing that you have to understand is that you will only be respected if you give respect. That's the first thing. So if you want to create a climate where you will be respected, then you have to, at every level, understand the implication of your own behavior, your team's behavior, and you have to understand what respect looks like in the real world to that customer. When we balance that well, when we go first, when we are respectful, when we go first, we create an environment where the customer typically is going to respond in kind. So we set the tone for this. And we set the tone not only when we're in front of the customer, what we say to them. We set the tone when we're talking about the customer with our colleagues when the customer isn't there.
Yep.
If I'm a sales leader, if I'm a vice president of sales like you, Chris, and I have a customer, and I talk disparagingly about that customer with my team, how in the world are they ever going to have the respect that's required when they talk to that customer? And as you know, Chris, it's not always what you say that is disrespectful. Sometimes it's the look on your face. Sometimes it's the way you do or don't return emails or phone calls. And it breeds and bleeds into it. So the first currency is respect. And it's respect across the chain. And if I'm respectful to the customer, both in front of them and not in front of them, if I build a culture of respect in my team, then that is where it starts for me. Number one, that's the first piece of advice that I would have. But respect isn't letting people just run all over you. And so that it doesn't have to be a respect that disregards your own self-worth and well-being. And so it can be balanced and managed. The second piece of advice that I would give you is don't be afraid to be the person who has that conversation with the customer. Because if they're treating you in an inappropriate way, chances are they treat a lot of their vendors, if you have multiple vendors, in an inappropriate way. And you may be the one person who's going to stand up in a respectful, confident way, and you might actually change the temperature and the tide for a number of people around you. So because the reality is that customer probably isn't just being that way with you. It's a pattern, and chances are it also affects their internal team. And so you're doing something for the greater good. And then lastly, it goes back to what I said in the beginning. We lay the foundation for a difficult conversation in year 2 of our relationship with the customer of how we started. The expectations we lay, how we deal with things early, how we set the expectation of how we're going to deal with conflict, what are we going to do if there's disappointment, and we set the stage in the beginning days. And if we are consistent, and if we are persistent, and if when we make a mistake, we acknowledge it first, and we go first with the customer, then we will set the paradigm of expectation. So here's my best advice as we end. The next time you and your company shits the bed, and even before the customer finds out, here's where you'll set the stage. Reach out to them, not by email, but by phone, and own the problem. Fess up. Model how you're going to deal with problems. Go first. Don't hide. When you do that, you'll be setting the tone of what you expect in the relationship. And people's respect for you will grow. You will solve problems better. You will have better conversations. And you will become a better partner to the person that you have moved through the tunnel of chaos, the tunnel of difficulty with, to the other side of true relational partnership, which is what we ought to all be striving for if we are unpeddling and not just peddling shit and allowing people to shit on us in the process. That's my thoughts. Awesome. Listen, Chris, this is a great conversation, and just as we move into this, we're early on in this series. The way we see this, I think, starting to shape is you and I will have a conversation just between you and I, probably once a month. I'll have some things that I wanna braille out with you and get you to connect on. You got some things that you want to talk to me on. The reality is, Chris, is that we've been doing this together for a long time. I mean, you started before you graduated school. You did work in our marketing business, and we did some work together there. And your first job that you had in the marketing side, I was a consultant in the company that you were working with, and you got me that gig. And then you've now moved to a different company that I have a relationship as well. And so we get to work together a lot, and we have these kind of conversations a lot. More than our wives would like us to. Oftentimes when we're having family dinners, we're having conversations about work. But we're going to let the audience, our listeners, into the conversations that you and I have, how we challenge one another about the art and craft of selling, how we challenge ourselves to be better contributor to this sales profession. And so tonight, all we're doing in this episode is letting people into this conversation, and that we have a lot about sales and marketing and the importance of partnership. And so tonight, that's what we're doing. And then in the other episodes, we'll bring people into that conversation. And so, listen, as you guys unpack all this and you unpeddle in your own world, do Chris and I a favor. Email me at tim@theuncommodified.com or connect with Chris and I on social media. And let us know how you're using this provocation tonight, this conversation, a difficult conversation about entering into difficult conversations with your customers, not being afraid of it. Let us know what you're doing with this information. Let us know how you're challenging yourself with this. And even let us know if you need help with a difficult conversation. If you're struggling, reach out to me on social media. I'm happy to help you with that. Thanks for listening, and have an excellent day.